I stood in the doorway of my new bedroom, still clutching the box of clothes I meant to unpack hours ago. The room was just as I left it, dim, uninviting and eerily still. My distant aunt had left me the house in her will, though I barely remembered her. It was old, with creaky floorboards and a faint scent of mildew clinging to the walls, but it was mine. A chance to start over, or so I'd thought. The mirror caught my eye as soon as I stepped inside. It was huge, standing taller than me, framed in dark, intricate wood carvings that twisted like ivy. I hadn't noticed it when I toured the house before moving in, but there it stood now, propped against the far wall, like it had been waiting for me. The glass wasn't perfect. Faint smudges marred the surface, and in the flickering light of the single overhead bulb, the reflection seemed off. Shadows in the room looked darker in the mirror, deeper. I shook off the feeling, telling myself I was just tired. The first night was uneventful until the tapping started. I just turned off the lights when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tap tap tap. At first, I thought it was rain against the window, but when I looked, the night was clear. The sound seemed to come from somewhere in the room. Just the house settling, I muttered aloud, though my voice sounded thin, uncertain. I crawled into bed and pulled the blankets up to my chin, but the sound persisted. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to keep me awake, my pulse thudding in time with the taps. Eventually, exhaustion won. The tapping faded into the background, and I drifted into a restless sleep. In the morning, I noticed something strange. The smudges on the mirror were gone, wiped clean overnight. I didn't clean them. The second night, the tapping started again. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore it. It wasn't the creak of the house settling, nor the sound of branches brushing against the windows. No, this was deliberate, precise, like someone tapping their fingernail against glass. I squeezed my eyes shut and told myself it was nothing. But when I opened them, the mirror seemed to glint in the faint moonlight creeping through the curtains, as if daring me to look. "Get a grip," I whispered, forcing myself to sit up. The floorboards groaned as I approached the mirror. My reflection stared back at me, pale and tired looking, but otherwise normal. I ran a hand through my hair and leaned closer, studying the frame. The carvings looked almost alive in the shadows, twisting and curling into shapes I couldn't quite define. And then I saw it. Movement. I froze. My reflection didn't. The version of me in the mirror leaned forward slightly, her eyes widening, her lips parting as if to speak. My breath caught in my throat as I stumbled backward, my knees hitting the edge of the bed. "Stop it," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was talking to. My reflection moved again, its hand lifting toward the glass, pressing its fingers against the inside of the mirror. Not the outside side. I could see the faint fog of its breath on the glass. I blinked hard, and the image vanished. My reflection was normal again, mirroring my wide-eyed stare and trembling hands. I backed away slowly and grabbed my phone. The screen lit up, showing it was just after midnight. For some reason, that time felt wrong, like I shouldn't have been awake, like I shouldn't have been seeing what I'd just seen. I turned the mirror to face the wall before crawling back into bed, but it didn't help. All night I swore I could hear something faint so soft it could have been my imagination. It sounded like a voice. The third night, I told myself I wouldn't look at the mirror. Whatever I had seen or thought I'd seen, it had to be my imagination. Maybe I was overtired from unpacking and adjusting to the house, that's all. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I went to bed early, determined to sleep through the night. But it wasn't long before the tapping returned. It was louder this time, more urgent, like a demand I couldn't ignore. I squeezed the blanket over my head, heart pounding. The sound seemed to echo, each tap vibrating through the walls, the floor, and my chest. And then, just as I was sure I couldn't bear it any longer, it stopped. I let out a shaky breath, thinking maybe it was over. That's when I heard it. A whisper. I flung the blanket off and sat up, staring toward the mirror. It was still turned to face the wall, but the whisper came from its direction. The voice was faint, muffled, as though it was trapped behind glass. "Help me." I froze. The words were barely audible, but I couldn't mistake them. I didn't want to move, didn't want to get out of bed, but my legs acted on their own. I approached the mirror with hesitant steps, the air around it cold and sharp, like stepping into a freezer. Slowly, I turned the mirror back around. The glass was foggy again, as though someone had breathed across its surface. But this time, there was something more. A word. Scrawled in the condensation was a single, shaky plea. "Help." The room tilted around me as my knees gave out, landing hard on the floor. My chest tightened with fear. But underneath it, I felt something else's strange pull, a compulsion to listen. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. For a moment, the mirror was still, silent, and then, faintly, the outline of a face appeared in the glass. It wasn't my reflection. Her hollow eyes stared at me, her lips moving soundlessly, before the whisper returned. "Help me." I couldn't sleep after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face those hollow eyes, her mouth forming silent words, over and over. The next day, I decided to do some digging. I had to know where the mirror came from and why it was in this house. I started with the attic, which was cluttered with old boxes and dust-covered furniture. It smelled of mothballs and mildew, and the dim light filtering through the single small window barely helped me see. In one corner, I found a stack of yellowed newspapers tied together with twine. Most of them were local stories from decades ago, small-town gossip and uneventful headlines. But one paper caught my attention. The front page bore a faded photograph of a young woman. Her face was delicate, framed by dark curls, and her eyes stared directly at the camera with a faint sadness. The headline read, "Local woman vanishes without a trace." I sat down on the attic floor, my hands trembling as I read the article. The woman's name was Clara Hayes, and she had disappeared nearly 50 years ago. She was last seen in her family's home, which the article described as being on the edge of town. My stomach sank as I realized it was talking about this house. The article mentioned rumors of a fight between Clara and her husband on the night she vanished. Some suspected he had something to do with her disappearance, but no evidence was ever found. The case went cold, and Clara was eventually declared dead. I kept reading, desperate for more answers. In another box, I found a leather-bound journal. The handwriting inside was cramped and uneven. The ink faded with time, but one name kept appearing over and over. Clara. One entry made my blood run cold. "She won't leave me alone. I see her in the mirror, her face pale and angry." I thought breaking the mirror would stop her, but it only made things worse. "She knows what I did. She knows. God help me. She won't stop until I pay." I stared at the journal, my heart racing. The husband had written it. He must have been the one to trap her in the mirror. But how? And why? I had no idea what kind of dark power was tied to the mirror. But I knew one thing for sure. Clara wasn't resting. She was trapped. And she wanted me to set her free. That night, I sat in front of the mirror, clutching the journal like a shield. I wasn't sure what I was expecting: an explanation, a sign, something. The house was deathly quiet. The kind of silence that made you feel like you weren't alone. The mirror had changed since the first night. The surface wasn't just reflective anymore, it seemed deeper, darker. Like it wasn't just showing the room but a place far beyond it. When I looked into it, I saw faint shapes moving in the shadows. "Clara," I whispered, my voice breaking. "If you can hear me, I want to help you." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, her face appeared again, faint and flickering, as if the glass was struggling to hold her. Her lips moved, but this time, I didn't hear whispers. I heard something else. Behind her, deep in the mirror's darkness, there was a sound, a low, guttural growl. Clara's expression changed. Her hollow eyes widened, her mouth opening as if to scream, but no sound came out. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the glass, when suddenly the growl became a roar. The mirror shook violently, the ornate frame rattling as though it was about to shatter. I scrambled backward as the glass began to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. Something was coming through. The cold hit me first, a wave of air so sharp it felt like needles against my skin. And then it stepped out, a towering, shadowy figure with no discernible features, just blackness and malice. Its presence filled the room, sucking the air from my lungs. Clara appeared again, this time clearer, her hands pressed against the inside of the mirror. Her lips formed two words, desperate and pleading. "Break it." The shadow turned toward me, its eyeless face tilting as if studying me. My body refused to move, frozen in place as it reached out with an inky, claw-like hand. "Break it," I whispered, repeating Clara's words like a mantra, trying to gather the courage to act. The thing was nearly upon me, the room growing darker and colder with every second. With a surge of panic, I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a brass candlestick from the bedside table, and swung it as hard as I could. The glass shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, scattering across the floor. The shadow let out an inhuman shriek, a sound that burrowed into my skull, and then it was gone. Clara's face lingered for a moment in the shards, her expression soft and grateful, before fading away. And then, silence. The silence in the room felt heavier than the noise that had come before. I stayed on the floor, staring at the broken shards of the mirror scattered around me. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my heart still racing. It was over. At least I thought it was. The air in the room warmed slightly, the icy grip that had paralyzed me fading away. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. I looked down at one of the larger shards of glass near my hand. For a moment, I thought I saw her face. Clara's face, smiling faintly, her hollow eyes now filled with something like peace. "Thank you," I whispered. I didn't know if she could hear me, but I hoped she could. I spent the next hour sweeping up the broken glass, careful not to cut myself on the jagged edges. The ornate frame of the mirror lay against the wall, empty now, its twisted carvings still as unsettling as ever. I wrapped it in an old blanket and shoved it into the attic. I couldn't bear to look at it any longer. That night, I slept deeply for the first time since moving into the house. No tapping, no whispers, just quiet. But in the morning, I noticed something strange. The air in the bedroom felt different, heavier somehow. As I turned to leave, my foot brushed against something small on the floor, a tiny shard of the mirror I must have missed. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. For a split second, I thought I saw something in the reflection. Not Clara. Something darker. A chill ran down my spine, and I quickly wrapped the shard in a cloth before tossing it into the trash. But as I walked out of the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The house was quiet again, too quiet.